I'd like to welcome everybody to our Areopagus lecture series for the spring of 2008. It's good to see everybody here. Tonight we have the privilege of hearing Dr. Cal DeWitt give the talk entitled The International Evangelical Environmental Movement. My name is Fred Hahn, and I'm a faculty member in the Aerospace Engineering Department. And before we formally introduce Dr. DeWitt, I'd like to take a moment to tell you about our lecture series and its sponsor. This lecture series is sponsored by Areopagus and the Areopagus Graduate Student Fellowship. Areopagus is a campus ministry based on two main ideas: that learning and faith should complement each other, and also that the Christian message has continuing relevance to the context of higher education. Areopagus offers regular programming for faculty, staff, graduate students, and undergrads, and more information about events and details can be found on the website. The Areopagus Lecture Series brings Christian academics to Iowa State to present their professional work in a public setting where the implications of their faith for their work is apparent, both to Christians and to other members of the university community. So to introduce our speaker for tonight, I'll now turn things over to Dr. David Engel of the Iowa State University Department of Natural Resource Ecology and Management.
Thank you, Fred. I really do count it a great privilege and an honor to introduce Dr. DeWitt tonight. I think you already realize he's the professor at the Gaylord Nelson Center for Environmental Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Welcome you to Iowa State University, Cal. He and I just visited a few minutes ago about how we first met. He called me when I first arrived at Iowa State University. He called and had been looking for instructors at the Ensemble Institute, and somehow he found me. You may also know that he's the founding director and long-term president of the Ensemble Institute, about 25 years, in fact. In that conversation, very brief, found him to be an engaging and a winsome personality. Oddly enough, just several weeks ago, I found myself engaged again by Cal when he appeared as Krista Tippett's guest on American Public Media's radio conversation show, Speaking of Faith. Some of you have probably listened to that as well. In that show, Miss Tippett drew him to contrast his views with popularly held views of our time, including the seeming oxymoron of evangelical environmentalist. Well, he showed himself in that conversation to be, as he has shown as capably in other venues, the leading, really the architect and the apologist for the evangelical environmental movement. That is, teaching and promoting ideas of Christian environmental stewardship. I want to quote from David Roberts' introduction of his 2006 interview of Dr. DeWitt, when he said, "He's been one of the prime movers behind almost every significant collaboration between evangelicals, scientists, and politicians, including the much-discussed Evangelical Climate Initiative, a statement from high-profile evangelicals calling for concerted action to battle global warming." Well, indeed, a scientist, university scholar, and change agent within the evangelical and the environmental communities. Let's welcome Dr. DeWitt.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you so much for many of you having waited 24 hours for my arrival. I got absolutely stuck yesterday, and I know that some of you had planned to attend some of the other sessions that I was to have yesterday. But I'm here, and I see your weather is much better than ours. I counted only, I think, Randy, 24 cars in the ditch on the way over here from the airport. I am with the Gaylord Nelson Institute at the University of Wisconsin, and I hold a very peculiar position, which will relate to my topic tonight. The University of Wisconsin in the late 1960s, through their chancellor, Edwin Young, decided that it would address a growing problem in American universities, including the University of Wisconsin, and that problem was the increasing fragmentation of the disciplines. It wasn't that fragmentation of the disciplines and the subdivision of disciplines into more disciplines was necessarily unfruitful. In fact, it was extremely fruitful. But in the process of this fragmentation, we were increasingly getting a poorer understanding of the whole. And for example, the entire biosphere. Our economics began to deal mainly with dollars and cents, not with the economics of the movement of CO2 and oxygen through the atmospheric circulations and the exchanges with organisms on Earth. And our biology began to probe more and more deeply into the workings of cells and organelles and biomolecules. So this has brought us much progress, but it also has resulted in a lesser understanding of the whole. So what happened in this great effort made by the university, for which a Blue Ribbon Committee was appointed with pay for 3 years to address, they decided that what they would do is to create some sort of institute whose purpose would be to reunite the disciplines. And their thought was that it would be best to do this around a theme, and that theme that they chose was the environment. And that's the way the Gaylord Nelson Institute was born. It was not really created to address environmental problems. It used the environmental problems in the environment as the way to pull everything together again. And so what we have now in this institute is about 140 faculty members from every conceivable discipline across the campus in humanities, social sciences, the physical and biological sciences, all working together at the common purpose of uniting our understanding so that we can actually move on to understand the biosphere as a whole, but more principally to become better stewards of the whole. As I think of the entire biosphere and think of the ways that we have been dealing with it, one of the people I think of right away is James Lovelock, who is the person who developed the idea of the Gaia hypothesis, which many of you know about. And what he did, and I think it was really pioneering work, is he worked to understand the biosphere as kind of one large physiological system. It's generated a lot of debate and discussion, of course, but the thing that I am thinking of as I'm thinking of the biosphere and James Lovelock is the year 2000. And in the year 2000, I'll first give a little anecdote, and then I'll tell you what's going to, how I'm going to weave this into the topic tonight. I was the guest of the canon of St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, and I stayed at the castle for 4 nights. I walked over the tomb of Henry VIII every day as I was going from my room to meeting places. It was a remarkable experience. But I also went into St. George's Chapel in the afternoon to attend the service there, which is a beautiful service. And James Lovelock sat next to me in one of those services, and I was quite surprised because he's not impressed most people as being very religious. So on the way out, I said, "Jim, you were in the service with me." He says, "Of course, I'm an agnostic." Isn't that an interesting comment? I didn't really have to press it any farther. I knew what he meant. We're both scientists and we're both thinkers. And what he's doing is he's attending church yet because he doesn't know. And most of us who don't know don't go. It was a fascinating thing. But the reason that James Lovelock was there at Windsor Castle with me is that the John Ray Initiative, headed up by Sir John Houghton, who will figure in here in the climate change topic, James Lovelock and I were invited as 4 people, each to spend a half day presenting the case for our particular perspective of how we dealt with the degradation of the biosphere. And what had been done by this group of 25 thinkers the year before is they had played with a lot of ideas, and the idea they came up with that they wanted to test was the idea of stewardship. Some of you have, you've seen it in many, many different forms, but the idea of stewardship is an old term. It's an old idea. It comes from the Anglo-Saxon stig weird. Weird comes from, it's W-E-A-R-D, which is related to ward, which is related to warden. It's a keeper, and stig means sty, so it comes from the keeper of the pigsty for the lord of the manor. And it's a kind of humble term, actually. It's a very humble term, and what the John Ray Initiative had decided was to bring me in to speak in favor of stewardship as a concept for addressing the environmental crisis at the biospheric level, and James Lovelock to oppose it. And so we both spent a half day at this. We were not arguing against each other. We were just producing our own thoughts on this. And apparently... well, I know I quote one because he was asked at the end of the meeting, the day before the end of the meeting, well, Jim, what do you think about stewardship now? And Lovelock said, I like it. Well, we then all left except I was alone at the end of the conference with Sir John T. Houghton. And we had known each other a little bit. Remember, this is the year 2000. And we knew each other a little bit, but we thought it would be good to get acquainted more. And so we took the long walk. The long walk is about a 3 miles walk out from the castle, a great, long, linear green, wide and beautiful, with barns and farms en route. And as we were walking, we discovered that what we were discussing was what we would do with the rest of our lives. And we were doing that in a very serious way. And one of the things that Sir John was really concerned about was George Bush. He was concerned that George Bush was not getting the message on climate change. And he was also concerned about the U.S. government generally. And he was also concerned about evangelical Christians who really professed belief in the Creator, but they were kind of like, these are my terms, not his, they were kind of like people who praised Rembrandts by trampling all over Rembrandt's paintings, saying, praise Rembrandt, great painter, and you're tramping over the great masterworks. So what we decided as we were walking back, this is after about the first 3 miles, we decided we'd put on a forum that would bring together major climate scientists and evangelical leaders. We would hold it in England, and in fact that happened in Oxford in the year 2002 in the summer. And we had about 60 people present. And I'm going to cut this story, part of the story, very short and say that in the audience was Richard Cizik. Richard Cizik was, at that time and still is, the Vice President for Governmental Affairs of the National Association of Evangelicals in the United States. And that's probably the largest, well, it is the largest organization. I think it represents 55,000 congregations, many, many millions of members, tens of millions of members. And he was there with his wife, Ginny. And what he has said on interviews on National Public Radio is that that day for him, when he heard Sir John Houghton speak and the others, he said this was a conversion much like my conversion to Christ, to understanding climate change. And the reason now that that's so critical, and I present it really for two reasons. One, I like to give you the history, but I also like to give you some idea of what people like atmospheric physicist John Houghton and a biological scientist like me cook up sometimes to address issues, because both of us probably would have rather been back in our labs or in our fields, in the field work we were doing, than to meddle in this area. However, both of us, and I know this is shared with you, both of us had this tremendous passion for doing something about the planet's condition and the prospects for a planet that would get increasingly damaged by unthinking human beings. And we also knew that our president had the ear of the evangelicals in America, and vice versa. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2 is in 2000. In 2006. In 2006, Richard Cizik contacted Eric Shivrian. Eric Shivrian heads up the Center for Health and Environment at Harvard Medical School, and they soon asked E.O. Wilson to join them, and they had lunch together at the Cosmos Club, and decided maybe they should start a conversation. And I've got tonight I'm going to show you part of that conversation that was continuing from that. It's absolutely remarkable what has happened here, because if we go back in the history of evangelicalism in America, what you discover is that in 1859, at the publication of Darwin's Origin of the Species, a slight divide begins to take place between evangelicals and other Christians as well, and Jewish people as well, and science. Not a wide divide. In fact, Benjamin B. Warfield, who was the president of Princeton Theological Seminary, was a principal proponent of evolution and welcomed Darwin's treatise on the origin of species by means of natural selection. Interestingly, B.B. Warfield, considered to be the most brilliant of the theologians at the time, was also the originator of the idea of biblical inerrancy. Both together. Proponent of evolution and proponent of biblical inerrancy. That information I found out by research, which is one of the things that we do in universities, is we have a passion to know, and so you do research, and you don't just read about it in the newspaper. You dig and you dig and you dig, and I was absolutely shocked at this finding, because the divide is between people who profess biblical inerrancy on the one hand and evolution on the other, and right at the very start we have a person who holds both of them together. Curious, his father was a horse breeder, and they practiced artificial selection. They knew how it worked, and the big thing that was a problem for this great theologian was how God would ever make species fixed, because with changing environments and fixed species, what kind of providence is that? They should adapt. They should be allowed to adapt. And if horses could adapt, why couldn't the rest of the creation adapt? Who are we as horse breeders to be the only ones who can do this? That gives you some idea of how the divide wasn't that great. It just wasn't. But in 1925, the divide was deepened and widened with the Scopes monkey trial. You know what trials can do. Think of O.J. Simpson and think of all these different things. There are people who you never heard of before. There are issues you never heard of before, but they can get trumped up, and this one was trumped up a lot, and the division increased. And then what happened subsequent to that was with the origin of the moral majority in 1979. This became very politicized. Science began to get a very bad reputation by many of the radio speakers that were with the moral majority. Evolution and creation debates took on new vigor, and the divide deepened immensely. So much so that today we find in the evangelical world, or certainly we found a year ago in the evangelical world, a tremendous suspicion between science and evangelical Christianity. So much so that there's a lot of acrimony that is very evident even today in the literature. If some of you are keeping track of the correspondence of the Society of Conservation Biology on the web, on email, where they're working on a program relating to religion, you'd see a lot of this acrimony going on right at the moment. What did Wilson, Shivian, and Cizik decide at this meeting at the Cosmos Club? They decided that we should all meet together, even though this divide was clearly present, and we should do so in private. Not absolutely private, but don't invite all sorts of people together, because this is going to be a rough meeting. It's going to be very difficult, and it should be at a remote spot. So we flew into Tallahassee and drove from there to Malhana Plantation in South Georgia. And it was remarkable. E.O. Wilson from Harvard, the great modern-day Darwin. I mean, if there is a living Darwin, it's E.O. Wilson. Richard Cizik, if there ever was an evangelical conservative, and in every respect, that's Richard Cizik. Joel Hunter, who is one of the megachurch pastors from Northland Church in Orlando. Cheryl Johns, a professor in the Assembly of God Seminary, a very enthusiastic Pentecostal who speaks in tongues and does those things that lots of people wonder about. And Jim McCarthy, President-elect, he would be in just a couple of weeks from then, of the AAAS, and now is the president of AAAS, who is a great biological oceanographer and climate scientist at Harvard University, and the list goes on. 28 of us in that meeting. We sat at a big table, around a big table. It was a big room, about 28 of us, and we just told something about ourselves. We smiled. We were surprised at that. And we went around a second time, and the smiles increased. And what happened was that about the third time around, we had a coffee break, of course. But about the third time around, we began to like each other. And we found we shared immensely the same values about the planet and about the biosphere. And one of the things that was a tremendous icebreaker here was that E.O. Wilson, just a month or 6 weeks before, had his new book come out, and it is entitled The Creation. The Creation is an olive leaf that E.O. Wilson wrote to his Southern Baptist friends who really are his heritage. He was raised Southern Baptist, and he just kind of didn't come back. And he said, he's told me, he loves to listen to the oratory of these evangelical sermons on television. He does that regularly. But he's left that tradition too, even though he's inspired by the dynamism of these great preachers. The signing of his book was quite an event because here we were getting from the living Darwin of the day a book entitled The Creation, and in it there was a letter, that's the whole book, to a fictitious Southern Baptist pastor on what that pastor should be thinking about if he really took caring for creation seriously. What we did next in this meeting is we decided amongst us, this was unanimous decision, that we were both in the scientific community and in the evangelical community going to reinstate the term the creation into our vocabularies. You're beginning to see it in Science magazine. You're beginning to see it in correspondence between these great scientists. Why? Because as we conversed, we discovered something very, very important. And that is, we had replaced the word the creation with the words the environment, thinking more or less that these were alike. But finding in time that the environment really did not include us. It included everything except us, and the idea of the creation included people too. And it was a more holistic term, and we discussed this back and forth, and we came to realize that we had thrown out a great phrase, the creation. We had let it be taken by others for other purposes, like creationism, for example. And then we had dinner, we had breakfast, we had more discussions, and the conclusion was drawn that we should make a great statement. We didn't know to whom or when it would be announced or what it would contain, and so we start talking about that, and it was so remarkable to me that it was a secular scientist that introduced the more religious language into the statement we were drafting. I have to put this down so I can give E.O. Wilson's gesticulations. He said, let's refer to creation as a great gift. He did just like that. You can kind of see him do that. As a great gift. And everyone was nodding. Wilson saying creation is a great gift. No one dared ask, gift from whom? And we decided not to go there. It was remarkable. And so the result was an urgent call to action. Arrangements were made to make a presentation at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. by 10 of us, I think. Maybe it was 12. You'll be able to count them on the screen, maybe. But we would present this at the National Press Club at a major press conference. And this was done 1 year ago now, January 17, a year ago. And its impact has been absolutely immense. It's gone all through the NAE. It's gone through the leadership within the environmental community at the top levels. There's correspondence now going on regularly between the scientists and megachurch pastors. They're being invited to speak. It's an absolutely astounding shift in just perspective. It's not only happening here, but because Sir John Houghton is involved very much in this, it's happening also in other places in the world. And what we're expecting is that this is a very major and important step at pulling together. As we discussed many times, it's far more important deciding what we're going to do with creation than it is to decide how it came to be. When we first heard that, some were uneasy with this. Like, shouldn't we first figure out how it got here before we decide to take care of it? No one really thought that seriously. They thought, in fact, someone said, quoting from Job 38, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" Like, who are you to figure out what I did? Why don't you get on with your task now, as it's given in Genesis 2:15, to avad the garden and to shamar it. The avad word Hebrew means to serve. It's the word from which we get our concept of serving the garden or serving the creation reciprocally as it serves us. It's a con-service. It's a conservancy, a conservation. Interestingly, the police cars in a big city not too far from here has the motto on the side, to serve and to protect. That's a translation of Genesis 2:15 by Jewish police commissioners, and it's applied to the gardeners of Chicago, whose motto is Urbis et Hortus, a horticultural garden. That's what Chicago is. And it is served and protected, according to Genesis 2:15, by the gardeners, Gaurdenr, that's called the Chicago Police Department. Isn't that interesting? And guess what? Toronto, the police cars there have on their sides painted the motto, to serve and to protect. And in Vancouver, the same thing, to serve and to protect. That verse is getting to be everywhere. And it really is kind of a key verse. When Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot were riding together on horseback prior to the first great meeting of the governors of the United States, Teddy turned to Pinchot and said, "What do we call this big governors conference?" And Pinchot said, "We'll call it conservation." Interesting. Both of them of a heritage that knew this particular passage. So we have obscured that fact for a while now, and it's starting to come out, and everyone's getting pretty excited about it. That conservation doesn't mean planting floribunda roses in rows to prevent wind erosion on a field. It means returning the service of the biosphere with service of our own. It's a reciprocal service. So what is a conservative? By this definition, it's someone who never takes without giving back. That's what a conservative is. And obviously, when I say this to conservatives, some of them get very troubled by this, because they'd like to say, not all of them, but some of them like to say, can't we just keep taking without giving back? No, not if you do conservice. If you want to steal, that's called stealing, but conservice means reciprocal service. Well, I'm trying now to kind of paint the picture where we have one of the bridges being built, and that's around the idea of conservice. But what I really want to do is to show these people saying these things in their own words. So we're going to start this press conference. We'll jump around a little bit in it, but we're taking you to Washington, D.C. The speaker first will be Eric Chevian, the director of the Center for Health and Environment at Harvard Medical School. And someone there can get our lights, perhaps, and as soon as we've got a screen.
Conference, organized by the Center for Health and the Global Environment at Harvard Medical School and the National Association of Evangelicals. I am Eric Chevian, director of the center, and I want you to notice that Jim McCarthy and I are both wearing polar bear ties for this event. All of us are here this morning to tell you about the start of a remarkable new coalition of scientists and evangelicals who have joined forces to protect the creation, the global environment. When my close friend Richard Cizik and I were having lunch more than a year ago, we talked about the dangerous degree of distrust between many scientists and evangelicals. Dangerous because despite well-known differences on some issues, these two groups clearly shared a deep reverence for life on Earth and a profound concern and sense of urgency about what human activity was doing to it. It was critically important, we believed, that if we were to make any progress in addressing such issues as global warming and habitat destruction, these two enormously powerful communities in our society had to work together, and yet they were hardly speaking to one another. Richard and I proposed that we convene a meeting of prominent scientists and evangelical leaders to break this impasse, and we soon asked Ed Wilson to join us. Some 30 leading scientists and evangelicals met over 3 days at a private retreat last month. We reviewed the science, about which there was no disagreement, that the natural world is imperiled by human behaviors and policies, especially by our unsustainable burning of fossil fuels and our degradation of living systems. Human health and life are also highly endangered by these activities, with the disadvantaged placed at the greatest risk. We agreed that there was no such thing as a Republican or Democratic, a liberal or conservative, a religious or secular environment, that we all breathed the same air and drank the same water and relied on the same organisms for our survival. We discovered that we shared a deep moral commitment to preserve this precious gift we have all been given, and we pledged, all of us, to do everything in our power to protect it. That is why we are here today, and that is why we are releasing this joint statement that you have in your packets. This coalition is but 6 weeks old. It has only just begun, and we don't yet know how it will be organized, how it will develop, and all the activities that it will plan. But what we do know is this, that we have begun a critically important dialogue, that we scientists and evangelicals are committed to speaking with one voice about the global environment, that we will reach out broadly to involve other colleagues in our work, that we will inform political leaders and policymakers from both parties of our efforts, including at meetings this afternoon and tomorrow morning on Capitol Hill, that we will bring our two communities together for a large public meeting in the near future, and that this initiative, we are convinced, will grow in size and influence, and that it has the capacity to capture the attention and imagination of millions of Americans, to awaken them to the urgency of our concerns, and to move them by our shared commitment to protect life on Earth. Now I turn the podium over to my friend and colleague in this initiative, Richard Cizik.
Good morning. Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. My name is Rich Cizik, and I'm the Vice President for Governmental Affairs of the National Association of Evangelicals. It's my great delight to be here with all of these men and women, particularly Eric, who I would have to say, as head of the Center for Health and Global Environment at the Harvard Medical School, this event would not have happened, Eric, without you. Without your passion, your intellect, your sensitivity to spiritual things, sensitivity to the things of God, I think, have made this possible, and it's extraordinary. The National Association of Evangelicals began its own journey toward responsible care of the creation in 2004 when we released this landmark document called For the Health of the Nation, an Evangelical Call to Civic Engagement. An extraordinary document that chronicles our responsibility in public life and for the care of creation. After the release of that document 4 years ago, in 2006, in February, many of our leaders in the NAE and other evangelical leaders released this document called Climate Change and Evangelical Call to Action. And as a result, I think many leaders outside our two communities of religion and science, they would say that global warming has turned from a partisan issue of debate among politicians into a moral concern for all Americans. And that's an extraordinary development. It's right. In the summer of 2006, Eric suggested lunch with E.O. Wilson, probably the world's most renowned scientist. And I'll have to admit to being intimidated, in spite of having met world leaders and presidents. Intimidated, no need. What I discovered, of course, was a man of great intellect, warmth, and humility. And the three of us shared, Eric, Ed, and myself, this desire to do something different to protect our creation. And thus was born the idea that Eric and I had discussed a dialogue between science and religion, which was held in December at Malhana Plantation in Georgia. It's my hope and prayer that the conversation that began that day will blossom and grow into a national and international movement. Obviously, as evangelicals, we believe that God will judge us if we destroy, through the loss of biodiversity, human-induced climate change, and the like, God will judge us for destroying the creation. And therefore, we as evangelicals have a special obligation, a duty of stewardship, to be more vigilant, in fact, than others. And so next month, in this same vein, the NAE will announce the first ever partnership with the EPA, the Environmental Protection Association's Energy Star program, to reduce energy consumption in our respective 45,000 churches from 54 denominations. Today, we want to explain the consensus that led to the call to action, signed by those here and some in the audience. And by standing together, we as evangelicals are saying that science can be an ally in helping us to understand what creation is telling us about itself and about its maker. Great scientists are people of imagination, so are people of great faith. We desire to imagine a world in which science and religion cooperate together, minimizing our differences about how creation came to be, to work together to reverse its degradation. We will not allow, evangelical Christians with scientists here today, we will not allow the creation, to be degraded, destroyed by human folly. Thank you. Eric?
We will now hear from our extraordinary panelists to my right and left, esteemed leaders in the scientific and evangelical communities who will speak about their environmental and associated moral concerns and about our new collaboration. Their bios are in your packets, so we will introduce them only by name. Their statements are also in your packets. Jim Hansen and Cal DeWitt will start by addressing the question, what is the magnitude of the threat we face to life on Earth scientifically and morally. Jim?
Thank you. Climate change is happening. Animals know it. Many are trying to migrate to stay within their climate zone, but some are running out of real estate. They are in trouble. Humans are beginning to notice climate change, but most people are unaware of the urgency for actions to avoid real dangers. Dangers most irreversible include extermination of species, disintegration of ice sheets and sea level rise, and increase of climate extremes. 1/4 of carbon dioxide that we put in the air by burning fossil fuels will stay there forever, more than 500 years. If we burn all fossil fuels without capturing and sequestering the CO2, we will create a different planet. We will destroy creation. We do not blame anyone for the present situation. Until recently, the consequences of our actions were not clear. We can still avoid dramatic climate change. We must stop the growth of CO2 emissions now and reduce emissions in the next few decades, and by perhaps 80% before the end of the century. Other air pollutants must also be reduced. And there will be many benefits of reducing emissions, especially to energy independence and national security. And my comments that touch on policy are my personal opinion. But I believe it is time for us to support and even demand policies that adequately address these climate and energy matters. We owe that to our children and grandchildren so they can enjoy the full wonders of creation. Thanks.
If we listen to what Earth is telling us, both directly and through scientists like Dr. Hansen, if we stop to behold the creation around us and also to see what we are doing to it, we can hear the voice of the biblical prophet Ezekiel. Is it not enough for you to drink the pure water? Must you also muddy the rest with your feet? Echoing this in our day, is it not enough for you to enjoy a pleasant climate? Must you also destroy the climate system? Is it not enough for you to enjoy the great myriad of creatures? Must you also extinguish them? Such destruction and extinction as we now face brings sorrow to their Maker. Our immediate moral imperative is to stop for a moment, or a day, or more, to behold the beauty of the earth and to observe its degradation. Biblically, Jesus still invites us to behold the birds of the air, to behold the lilies of the field, and God invites us, everyone, to behold the magnificent animals. But Scripture laments, is it nothing to you, all ye that pass by? Behold and see if there be any sorrow like unto my sorrow. If we stop to behold as we now must, we can rediscover the beauty of the earth. And through this we can find that we ought not only be takers from the earth, but ought to return its service with service of our own in gratitude. A con-service, a conservation. Many American police cars carry the motto, to serve and to protect, from Genesis 2:15, reminding us that we ought to be more than takers. This motto reminds us that everyone ought to serve, the Hebrew word avad, and protect, the Hebrew word shamar, the garden, and the creation. More than takers, we are caretakers. By returning creation's service with service of our own, we care for creation, we restore what has been spoiled, we preserve the species, and care for the climate system we hold in trust.
Doctors Peter Raven and Randy Isaac will next speak.
The projected loss of perhaps half of all species of plants and animals on Earth during the course of the century that we've just entered represents an extinction event as catastrophic as that which ended the age of dinosaurs 65 million years ago, but the cause in this case is us and us alone. We're the ones who are responsible. Current mass extinction results from pressures associated with rapidly growing numbers of human beings, our increasing expectations for individual consumption, and our continuing and spreading use of often unsustainable resources. In the words of Patriarch Bartholomew I, the destruction of nature is, quote, brought about by an economic and technological progress which does not recognize and take into account its limits. Each of the species we're driving to extinction represents a unique entity that once gone will never exist again. Species, of course, have become extinct regularly over the course of time, and the species that are alive today represent only a very small proportion of those that have ever lived, perhaps something like 3%. Today, however, the rate of extinction for which we're responsible is thousands of times faster than the rate at which new species originate, and that rate is growing rapidly. Because we're entirely dependent for our lives on other organisms and simply would not exist without them, I am delighted to be working with Christian evangelical leaders to try to find new ways to protect them. The abundant productivity and diverse properties of these organisms hold vital keys to attaining social justice and alleviating poverty around the world. Whether we realize it or not, our continued existence, many of our dreams of a better life, and much of our inspiration and joy depends on them. In caring for our common home, we share a cause that inspires us all. As Edward Brown points out, the church must be mobilized if all the rest is to happen. So must we all, which is why we delight in trying to do it together.
I'm Randy Isaac, Director of the American Scientific Affiliation, a fellowship of Christians in science. In our vast universe, as far as we know, planet Earth is the only place where a rich diversity of life exists. God has created a diverse array of species that thrive in a web of interdependence. Each species has a purpose-driven existence, to paraphrase Rick Warren's best-selling book. Each species fills a critical niche in the dynamic balance of nature. Throughout the history of life on Earth, the number and types of species have changed in response to changes in the environment. But whenever
social attitudes and government policies. As we engage in
We've
this work
just
together,
shifted
it may
to
lead to a
David
second
Gushee.
historic achievement,
That's E.O. Wilson in
improving
the
the
background.
relationship between the scientific and religious communities in America.
Science and religion are the two most powerful social forces in the world. The so-called culture wars between them have needlessly blocked full cooperation, as the previous speakers have noted, between secular scientists and religious faithful in solving some of the greatest problems facing humanity today, among which the most fundamental is the deterioration of the environment of Earth. Although climate change and exhaustion of natural resources are by themselves paramount in importance, there's one less well understood process linked to them that is both huge and irreversible, and that is the ongoing loss of Earth's biodiversity, or, if you will, the creation. If current deterioration of the environment by human activity continues unabated, half of Earth's surviving species, plants and animals, as noted by Dr. Raven, will be extinguished or critically endangered by the end of the century. 1/4, it's been estimated, could leave us in the next 50 years due to climate change alone. The price for human generations into the far future is going to be paid in economic opportunity, environmental security, and spiritual fulfillment. The saving of the living environment is therefore an issue appropriately addressed jointly by science and religion. The problem of global conservation can be solved. The resources to do it exist. The cost will not be high. We've already made estimates of how much it would cost. And the benefits are immense beyond calculation. At the end of the day, however, and this is the point, substantially, the main point of today's meeting, the direction we take will be an ethical decision. It will have to have a religious intensity. A civilization able to envision God in an afterlife and to embark on the colonization of space is surely going to find the way to save the integrity of this magnificent planet and the life that it harbors, because, simply, it is the right thing to do and an ennobling responsibility for all of us.
Joel Hunter and Rita Caldwell will answer this question: where do we go from here in terms of educating the public and policymakers?
My name is Joel Hunter, and I'm one of a growing number of local pastors who intends to do what is right in caring for God's creation. For the evangelical Christian, God's mandate to protect the garden is still a moral imperative for today. There is an emerging awareness among churches that protecting the environment is another way of protecting life, preserving life, specifically for the poor who are least able to be insulated from environmental deterioration. And unless we protect the vulnerable, we are not representing Jesus very well. We are glad to be working with our friends in the scientific community. They have the facts that we need to present to our congregations. We have the numbers of activists that will work through the church, in the government, in businesses to make a significant impact. We believe that in these days, God is putting together groups with a common cause who may have been adversarial at times in the past. But in this new collaboration, the world will be healthier and safer for everyone.
We can have the lights, if someone would do that for us. There's a little more here, but you certainly get the flavor of the conference, and you've seen some of the key people. One of the people we haven't seen yet, who was just really very eloquent, is our president of the AAAS. And after we're finished tonight, I'll show that segment. It's about another few minutes. But what I'd like to do to conclude here is to say that tonight in the speakers, me and E.O. Wilson and Peter Raven and Eric Shivian, also Rich Cizik, we decided as we were doing this work together that we would take this DVD with us, and it would be kind of a joint presentation by all of us to wherever we are lecturing, And so this sort of presentation probably has been made at the Missouri Botanical Gardens, at Harvard University, at some AAAS meetings. It's remarkable that this summer I'm working at the Faraday Institute at Cambridge University. We are addressing a major question. The major question is, what is the nature of the system that we have created that's doing in the creation, and what can we do about it? And when I invited Jim McCarthy, the AAAS president, to come, he said, he had a committee meeting, a high-level committee meeting to plan their next AAAS convention, but he would get a note out to them to change the date, which he did. And so he is joining us at Cambridge University. Donald Hay is joining us from Oxford. He is a key economist. John Houghton will be there, of course, covering climate and many others. And what we're doing now is to take the next step to bring this out internationally. And so that's part of the next step. The other thing is that tomorrow I leave here to Orlando to go to Joel Hunter's church and in Orlando, and he has summoned his colleagues in mega churches and other churches from across America to join us there. And I'm giving them a keynote speech on caring for creation, and he is as well. And this is going to be another step. So things are moving. We have no idea how wide this impact will be, but one of the things you'll see if we continue this tape is that toward the end of the news conference, we got a letter from someone I hadn't heard of before, or not much, someone by the name of Barack Obama, saying that this is a remarkable news conference. He supports it fully. That's not a political statement, I hope. It wasn't then, but now, given the fact that if I were doing this in Wisconsin, no, the polls have already closed. So, but it's creating a great stir. How about the rest of the religious world? I'm working with Jewish rabbis and Jewish scientists in a group we call the Noah Alliance, which is a unified approach between evangelicals and Jewish scientists and rabbis. And we're working together on the Endangered Species Act in particular. And then there are lots of mainline churches that are involved in various ways. Many of my students are have leadership roles in that. So things are moving. What I wanted to do this evening is to use this occasion, which is a very good one with the Areopagus Forum, where we really are bridging across, and to show here that this bridging across is happening. It looks like it's very successful. If you just look at the political consequences of this in this current election year, there are very many signs that people are now voting according to their values rather than just identifying themselves with a particular candidate or a particular party. And that's been a result of a concerted effort. So I thank you for participating in this. One of the things that's happening at Ohio State University, I've just been invited to help in this or participate in it, is they're going to do a repeat of this amongst their key scientists in Ohio and their key evangelical leaders, and they're going to do a kind of replication of this for the state of Ohio. I don't know if anything like this might happen in Iowa, but it's a possibility. This is my third trip to Iowa in the last 6 weeks. In Sioux County, I presented to 10% of the whole population in a series of lectures, land trust and land stewardship for the whole county. And it's an exciting prospect. And then I was at your neighboring institution, Central College, just a short 2 weeks ago, I think. And they are going green. They have 2 buildings with solar panels, and I was picked up at the airport in Aprevia with a college seal on it. And the president says, no, this isn't what we're doing. We're just suiting up for what we have to do. But all their subsequent buildings will be LEED certified at Central College. This state has the potential of leading the nation, and I hope you'll be inspired by this. Maybe you'll do it differently, but my major purpose in bringing this to you this evening is to give us all hope that the world will be better for all of our work and our love for this remarkable planet. Thank you.
We probably have time for a question or two, if anybody has a question.
Is there any organized movement within the church to use funds raised by the church to help with environmental matters?
It's happening, but it's not very well organized yet. It's kind of like what you heard on this press conference. Just 6 weeks ago, we met. But there are some churches now, there are individual congregations moving strongly ahead. Probably the most dramatic of these is the Boise Vineyard Church in Idaho that is transforming all of their operations. That whole congregation works high in the mountains to restore trails and for working with the Forest Service. So they have a website called Let's Tend the Garden. There's that garden again. Let's Tend the Garden. So if you just look up, no apostrophe, letstendthegarden.org, you'd come to their site. And I would also watch Orlando's church, the Orlando church, Joel Hunter's church. It's if you just look up Orlando Joel Hunter, you'll come up with their program. There are some churches, individual buildings now that are being restructured, new structures built with solar, and lots of study materials. One of the things that I was asked to do was to write a book on the subject, and I'm not a very good salesman because I never thought of that book until just now. The publisher probably would be rather angry with me. Does someone have a copy they could hold up? See how popular this book is? There we go. Look at this. There it is. It's called Earthwise, and it sells for $10. I checked it up out on Amazon.com a couple of weeks ago, and they still had the old edition, 1991, up. So, but this is just out. It's just a couple of months out of press, out of the printer. So that's a great guide for church discussion groups primarily. It covers biblical, theological principles.
Yeah, if I may, there was some talk about perhaps a book club that might read this together.
That's great. I did another book with some other people years ago, and it's called Earthkeeping, not Earthwise, Earthkeeping. And I was asked to come to the DNR for a luncheon meeting in, I think, I forget now, maybe 1982. And so I came to lunch, and here were all these DNR employees, and they were studying my book, which was environmental stewardship, including biblical and scientific perspective on it. It's happening everywhere now, and it's very, very exciting to see. And but it already started back in the 80s. Another thing you should realize is that during the 1970s, that this divide was not expressed in the voting booth or in public policy. The 1970s were that were those great years where the Endangered Species Act and some 18 or 20 pieces of U.S. legislation were put in. There were very favorable articles on this in the Christian media as well as in the press. It was just solidly supported. This thing began to unknit in 1979 with the rise of the moral majority and the politicization of evangelical religion. That's one of the reasons I'm mentioning evangelicals, because the politicization of religions has not impacted the other faiths nearly as much as it has evangelicals. So that's one question I sometimes ask, or I'm asked, why just evangelicals? It's because that's where the trouble is. Yes?
Similarly, I guess, concerning politicians on the right, for instance, Governor Huckabee,
Yes.
openly talks about conserving, and some of these messages that you're talking about, do you see that in other people, or do you think he's one person that could bring that conversation to the table? Because I know several evangelicals have voted for him.
Yeah. I think all the four candidates, the leading candidates now, and we could add six or eight, are pretty well in tune with this. The message that came out by some of the evangelical pastors, the really influential ones, the ones that were listed on the cover of Time magazine a couple of years ago, some of them, like Try Robinson, said, "You politicians out there, you listen. The last election was the last time we would vote on a single issue. Life is the whole creation, and you listen." Now, that's coming from a large church pastor who is a rancher, a dyed-in-the-wool Republican, and he's saying, "I'm not going to vote Republican if you guys don't care for creation." And he's a rancher. I mean, he has horses, and he has bales of hay, and he's a cool guy. But he's where we've had the trouble before. If the ranchers come on this, following Try Robinson, and he's leading them on field trips high in the mountains of Idaho, to work cooperatively with the Forest Service, and the Forest Service says, "No one ever has volunteered to help us before." And they're just amazed. And then there's one not too bright spot, but it's interesting. There are two pilots in his congregation, and he flies them to the highest peaks where the trails don't go. I suppose they get a big thrill out of trying to land on a mountaintop. But it's really neat. It's really neat. This church has the Vineyard Church, which is his church, has a food pantry, but it's a much bigger food pantry than anything else you would see, because it serves the other 26 food pantries in Boise. And it has the only recycling program in all of Boise. And people come to that church just so they can recycle. So some of you are really out to get membership in your churches. You might just turn it into a recycling center, and maybe at least they'll come up to your trash bin. Yes, sir.
I got to put in a quick plug first before I ask my question.
Sure.
I'm the director of Iowa Interfaith Power and Light.
Oh, you are? How good.
Five state affiliates of Interfaith Power and Light, which works to empower the religious response to global warming by bringing together Jews, Christians.
Would you like the microphone?
But anyways, we do work on global warming, public policy, congregations, individual homes, our production program. So if you want more information.
See him, for sure. See him. Every state, not every state, but many states. I work a lot with the Michigan Interfaith group. Yeah. Oh, yeah, there's a question.
I don't want to have people walk away from this thinking that all evangelicals have come around to this respect.
Oh, yeah, no. Yes, I have.
What is your take
look at the funding source, ExxonMobil. Yeah. It was really interesting how it was a couple of months ago. It was a big meeting, and I was there with a former president of Shell Canada and the former member of Parliament of Canada and me. We were speaking together on the Alberta tar sands and stewardship. And there was one question out of the audience. It was a real great question given to me. And all I had to do was say one word. The person asking the question said, "And why is this all happening so bad?" And all I did was to say, "Oil." That answers a lot. Does it? Yeah, it really does. It's oil, and then if you wanted to add Peabody coal to that, that would kind of fill out the other 40% of it. But I find it interesting. Sir John Houghton is an advisor to BP and also to Royal Dutch Shell. And these two companies have parted ways with the other oil companies to get into the energy business. And so what you see in BP is it now has become the world's largest producer of solar panels. And they call themselves BP, Beyond Petroleum. That doesn't mean they still are working with oil, but they're becoming an energy company. Isn't that an innovative idea? It's pretty obvious. And Royal Dutch Shell just built a new refinery in Holland, and it's got a CO2 scrubber on it, and it's hooked to a pipeline, and it goes for something like 40 kilometers and feeds CO2 into a whole string of greenhouses. And they're growing their plants in enriched CO2 atmospheres to make their tulips more massive.
I'd like to thank everybody for coming again, and we have refreshments here, so you are welcome to stick around for a while if you want to talk to Cal afterwards. But let's thank our speaker one more time.